Welcome to Supercool, the show about low-carbon innovation now scaling. Each week, we talk with the founders, CEOs, and executives, winning customers, growing revenue, and capturing markets by turning carbon-cutting ideas into competitive advantage. This is the rise of the low-carbon economy, a multi-trillion-dollar transformation already underway. I'm your host, Josh Dorfman. When it comes to the clean energy transition, understanding the scale of what's already happening and how much bigger it's going to get is really challenging. Imagine solar fields on the scale of the entire city of San Francisco already deployed across our nation. Installations so big it takes 3 hours to drive around their perimeter. In the United States alone, there are over 800 million solar panels installed. That's over 2 for every American. Globally, 1 billion new panels get installed every year, and that number is only increasing. Why? Because in most parts of the world, solar energy is both the cheapest form of new energy and the quickest to deploy. No energy shift in history has moved as fast as solar. Coal took half a century to overtake wood. Oil took another 50 years to overtake coal. Solar has gone from the margins to massive in under 20 years. By any historical measure, solar energy is scaling faster than any power source in the history of energy. And that begs 2 questions. Do we have enough raw inputs to keep going? Meaning, can we source enough aluminum, silver, copper, glass, and silicon to scale into the mega billions of panels? And what happens to all those solar panels at the end of their useful life? Enter SolarCycle. The company is leading the build-out of recycling and circular infrastructure for solar panels. Founded in 2022 by a world-class team that includes the former founder of Nextracker, the former head of global real estate at Amazon, and solar industry operators with deep expertise, SolarCycle has built technology to separate and recycle all the valuable components of solar panels, with the goal of putting those materials back into new solar production. Last year, the company recycled around 500,000 panels and is on track to recycle 1 million this year. Its customers include players like Sunrun, Brookfield, AES, and Engie. If they're deploying or managing large-scale solar, odds are SolarCycle already has a commercial relationship in place. But SolarCycle is more than a technology company. It's a logistics business for an entirely new supply chain. Every element has to be invented and optimized. How do you capture old or broken panels in the field? How do you stack them on a truck? Where do you site recycling facilities? Who buys the recycled materials? Every step must be refined to reduce cost and carbon for the business model to work. The future is literally depending on it, because there are not enough raw materials to scale the solar industry on its current growth trajectory. It already uses close to 20% of all silver globally. In the US, its aluminum demand would consume over 150% of current domestic supply. Recycling is paramount. New materials must come from the old to take us into the low-carbon future. Here to talk about it is Jesse Simons, SolarCycle's co-founder and chief operating officer. Jesse is an entrepreneur and an environmentalist to his core. After selling his first company, he joined the Sierra Club, where he spent 2 decades driving the clean energy transition, building campaigns, aligning with industry, and pushing for a better future. He's an operator, a leader, and as you'll hear, one of the most articulate champions for the future of solar and the future his company is helping to enable. Here's our conversation. Jesse, welcome to Supercool.
Josh, thanks for having me.
As I was doing some research on you and thinking about this episode and understanding your background, or some of your background, the fact that you had spent time at Sierra Club before SolarCycle, and it got me thinking, I was like, is Sierra Club, is that a feeder for climate tech startups? Because I know, Adam Morbach, who started eventually what is now called Trove, right? That is this great circular economy resale, re-commerce engine for brands like Patagonia and many, many others. And so then I punched it into ChatGPT, as one does in this day and age. And what came back was actually, no, it's not. There are 2. There is
I know Adam.
There is
There's
Adam,
me.
and there is you. And so that's very special. And of course, that has a lot to do, I think, with what animates the mission of SolarCycle, and as I understand a little bit about some of the conversations that led to the founding that you had with your co-founder and CEO. But why don't we start there? Take us back a little bit, tell us a little bit about your background, and then that moment and some of the conditions that were kind of emerging where you started thinking, recycling solar panels, this end-of-life situation, this is something that I really want to tackle and spend a really long time working on.
Yep, perfect. So, yeah, I started working for Sierra Club back in like 2001. So spent about 20 years there and really focused on climate and clean energy and how to transition the Sierra Club away from a group that mainly focused on lands protection to one that increasingly worked on how do we reduce carbon pollution, how do we accelerate clean energy deployment, things like solar, wind, batteries, et cetera. And the big thing that led me to start SolarCycle was this realization that it's twofold. One, that there weren't going to be enough minerals and materials to build the next wave of solar panels unless you figured out how to close the loop with the existing set of assets, right? The solar panels, the wind blades, the batteries. Like, you could build it once, but you couldn't throw all that away and then go get all that silver and copper and silicon and glass again. There just wouldn't be enough of that material. And that became clear to me as I was out there pushing for how do we rapidly phase out of coal? How do we rapidly phase out of natural gas? And you start looking at those numbers and you need a lot of solar and you need a lot of storage, you need a lot of wind. And there just wasn't enough of the raw minerals and materials to get there. And so that was like a key starting point for me, was that realization. And then the other one was, as I was going out with the Sierra Club to have coal plants retire and replace with clean energy, we'd be out there advocating for large solar farms out in places that aren't necessarily the most liberal places. And we found that those communities were very animated around this question of what's going to happen with these panels at the end of life. Are they going to be these orphan sites where panels are left here and everything ends up in a landfill and they're toxic and hazardous, and these questions? And I went to my friends in the solar industry. I was like, what's the answer here? What are we doing? Where are you going to get all the minerals? How are you going to deal with the end of life issues? And it was pretty clear they didn't have an answer. And that's where I was like, anybody working on that answer? And turned out one of the funders of the Beyond Coal campaign, this guy Subi Sharma, who actually is a neighbor of mine here in Oakland, California. He's like, I am really looking at this question too. Let's think about starting a company. And I was still at Sierra Club and he was still at Solaria, but we started working on it behind the scenes and pulling together research. And that's what led to the founding of the company, was this. He had been looking at it from a different angle, right? He was a panel maker and he was trying to figure out who can recycle my panels. And he found that there was nobody out there that was doing anything more than ripping the frame off, and then the rest was just getting landfilled. And he's like, we got to have a better solution. I've spent my life building solar panels. Nobody's got a way of dealing with it. And I was coming at it more from the, how do we protect the solar industry's social license to operate, right? Like, how can we keep, it's clean energy, but it's not clean energy if you're like destroying the planet to get all the minerals, and you've got human rights issues getting the minerals, and then you're throwing the panels in a landfill. You just can't do that. So that's what brought me to it. And that's how I got connected to my co-founder, Subi.
I love it. And I appreciate the perspective that you're bringing in terms of social license and being in communities where there's a real legitimate concern around, okay, if you're going to go build this very big solar farm, what happens 15, 20 years from now? Maybe you, upfront developer, are you still here? Who's responsible? What happens when those panels reach their end of life? Where are they going to go? Yep. I also think it's a little bit of a wise guys thing too. The guy who's in the bar who's like, oh yeah, solar, you know, all that stuff gets mined and then it's going to get thrown out, right? And it's like they're looking for a reason to dismiss solar. And it's like, oh, wind turbines kills birds, which matters. But I think what matters obviously more is what's happening when you're in that county meeting. You can say, look, we're thinking about this now, right? So, yeah, I think that's just very exciting. And one of the things I would just say, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the main reasons we've gotten so much customer traction is the big asset owners were finding that when they were seeking approval for these very large farms, the number one thing that was coming up was, what are you going to do with these things at the end of life? Aren't they toxic? Those kinds of issues. And being able to walk in with a company like SolarCycle, where we're able to say, hey, look, we have a long-term recycling services agreement in place with this company. We will take those panels, whether they break during construction or during a storm or at the end of life. That gave them a lot more credibility with the local communities and just kind of put that concern to bed in a lot of cases. Now, where there's still some radical people out there who weren't really paying attention to the facts and just wanted to, like you said, like, oh, windmills cause cancer. These solar panels are going to, when it rains, it leaks lead. Yeah, some of those people are out there, but the communities that we worked in anyway tended to, in almost every case, knowing that an agreement was in place with a company like SolarCycle, that removed that fear and allowed the projects to move forward. A major reason why I think we've been able to get traction is that these communities were slowing projects down, and we were able to put that to rest.
Okay, when you say like we've been able to put that concern to rest or whatever, your company's only 3.5, 4 years old, so a lot's moving very quickly, which seems like that's also a testament to the team that got put in place to actually bring this to market, really think about it with decades of experience, everyone who's sort of showing up to do this, right, who really understands the industry. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the team, and then we'll jump into at least how I conceive the product, and you tell me if I'm thinking about the right way. The offering, like how SolarCycle needs to set up and operate to be able to fulfill the mission.
Yeah, so about the team, we were really built by the solar industry for the solar industry to provide a solution that was really best in class for recycling. And it started, as I mentioned earlier, with me and Suvi, who worked together. He was a funder of Sierra Club's work on clean energy, and I was working as chief of staff there and national program director on climate. And we saw this opportunity to basically provide a solution where there was none and make it legitimate. Like, do the same thing that Suvi had done for solar panels, which was apply innovation, market forces, scale, operational excellence to drive the price of solar panels down 90% or whatever it is over the last decade. He and me saw that same possibility for solar panel recycling, but we realized that neither of us knew anything about recycling. This is awesome. We see the problem. I know sustainability. I know environment. I know how to get things through. I understand how these customers operate. He also really understood how to make panels. He had ideas on how to take them apart. But we were missing the person who actually had technology, had the patents and those things. And as we were doing our research, this one name kept coming up over and over again, Dr. Pablo Diaz, who had written all these different papers on how you do solar panel recycling efficiently, how you recover those materials. And as we did our research, we found he had not one, but 2 PhDs, one in e-waste recycling, another one specifically in solar panel recycling. And as we did a few calls with them to understand the market better, Suvi and I pretty quickly were like, we got to pull this guy in. And he was living in Australia at the time. And we're like, you got to come. We're starting the Silicon Valley startup. You got to come join us. Bring your wife. He's like, oh, yeah, I like Silicon Valley. And then next thing you know, we started our commercial pilot in Odessa, Texas. Odessa's great, so I'm not trying to diss it, but it's not Silicon Valley. And he came in and really brought in all of that expertise on e-waste recycling. He had done a ton of testing at the lab level on how to do it efficiently, how to extract maximum value, but at a speed that could bring the cost down. And so that was like a crucial addition to the team that I think helped us raise our seed funding. And then in between the seed funding and raising our Series A, we needed to bring in somebody who could actually take that lab level work and operationalize it. And that's when we recruited our chief operating officer, Rob Vinge, who cut his teeth at Cypress Semiconductor, but then ran global operations for SunPower, building all of their panels and their factories all over the world. And we actually recruited him away from Amazon, where he was the head of global real estate and was running all their solar all over the world, basically, among like everything else that's related to Amazon's real estate, which is pretty significant. And then the other key addition we had pretty early was our chief of sales, Ryan Booth, who had been the head of sales at Nextracker, the largest tracking company, and knew all the same customers. When you're selling trackers, you're working with the big asset owners like AES and EDP and Engie, and also the really big EPCs like Solve and McCarthy and these guys. Ryan knew all of that, deep network, and so we brought him in. And the combination of those folks, I think, with also the backing of our board and our seed investors, all of whom came from either solar or the circular economy, I think that really is what allowed us to separate ourselves from a number of other companies that were kind of getting started at that time. We were able to capitalize and then scale. And now we're at a point where last year we recycled 500,000 panels. We're on track to do 1 million this year we have 5 sites where we can now recycle, and we're doing it in a way that we think is really going to set the bar for the rest of the industry.
I love the idea of bringing in a really seasoned team that checks all those boxes. So you bring in the credibility, you bring in the expertise, and then you have to figure out how to operationalize this. I know that there's a number of patents connected to the company and the engineering process. When I think about your business broadly, I think, okay, you've got this reverse logistics arm. You've got to get out into the field wherever. And that sounds like it's kind of a diverse set of scenarios where you're taking panels. It could be panels are breaking, there's a storm, or it's just end of life of a project or something on a building. And I actually want to talk to you about that. People are repowering projects. I think that's really interesting. So we'll get to that. So there's this really interesting reverse logistics. We got to get the stuff back from the field. Then we have to run this manufacturing process as efficiently. I think I heard Suvi say, somewhat like 1 billion some odd solar panels were manufactured or installed maybe this year or last year. And you guys are the biggest solar panel recycling. You're going to do 1 million this year in a market where 1 billion are going out into the world, and the industry is going to have to scale to that billion, the ability to do 1 billion panels, right, of recycling. So it's just massive. So I want to dig in also, I really want to dig in and understand the manufacturing process. And then there's the market making process where it's like, okay, you're going to get the aluminum, you're going to get the glass, you're going to get the copper, the silver, the silicon, the plastics, whatever. Now we got to go figure out how do we optimize how these go back, create the circularity, who are the customers ultimately for this. So it's a really interesting chain. We can start anywhere, but I would love to start in the factory and just understand, like, what does it mean to actually take a panel back and recycle it so you can actually get everything back in a way where it is usable and flows back into the economy?
Yeah, love to talk about that. And let me just actually start one step before that, which is you mentioned reverse logistics. And I left out 2 critical people of our early team, which are people we brought in to really help us optimize all the different aspects of getting a panel from wherever it broke in the world to our site with the minimum amount of greenhouse gases and minimum amount of cost. And first person is our vice president of logistics, Joan Hahn, who ran all of global logistics for Nextracker. She was one of our first hires. And it's because we recognized, like, getting very good at that was going to be a differentiator here, right? Because Rob, he came from Amazon. He knew how important that was. The margins in the solar industry are pretty tight, and therefore you really need to get good at that piece. And so Joan was one of our first hires, and she has helped us get extremely good at driving our price down every month, basically, on moving panels from where they break out into our factory. And then the other person is Todd Phillips, who runs all of our customer operations, but he's the person we send out to the site. He spent years at Nextracker going out to their sites to put these panels in the ground in the first place. Now he goes out there when there's a hailstorm or construction breakage and helps the customer figure out, okay, how do I package these? How do I get the maximum number of panels into a truck as quickly and cheaply as possible and back to the factory? So I just wanted to name those 2 people on the team, but also let you know that there's quite a bit of special sauce that goes into getting panels from the site to our factory.
So hold one second, because I want to stay on that too, because that's like super interesting to me. And part of the reason why it probably really resonates, I think, is twofold. One is, I mentioned to you before we came on air, I'd started this company Planted. So we were thinking, okay, we're going to grow this grass. It's going to grow 10 times faster than trees. We think we're going to win on the farm versus the forest in terms of the economics of trying to get to a more sustainable carbon negative product, right? We know we're going to win in the factory, or we have high confidence. We're going to bring in a SpaceX team. We're going to create a different technological approach that we believe in. But then there's this other piece of how does the grass get from where it is to the factory? And for a tree, which is really heavy, and it's like 50% water, that's a very inefficient and very expensive part of the chain where we felt like, there's a real advantage if we can figure that out. But I wouldn't have thought it just wouldn't have occurred to me like, oh, right, you guys have to get so efficient in how you actually grab those panels and get them to you, because it could be a huge cost that could blow your model unless you really 100%. Figure it out.
Yeah. Getting that right or wrong is the difference in this business succeeding. And part of it is as simple and not that surprising. Having more locations around the country is critical, right? So we started in Texas with our commercial pilot in Odessa because, look, that's in the center of the country. We can live with some non-optimized costs to begin with as we're getting going. But eventually, we need to be within a day's truck drive of 80 to 90% of all installed panels. And as of this coming January, we will have that. We will have facilities in Nevada, in Arizona, in Texas, in Chicago and in Georgia. But we spent a lot of time trying to figure out all the SIA maps and all the Wood Mackenzie maps to figure out where are the panels installed and which are the older ones. And that helped us select those locations. So that's like kind of obvious, but also really important because it's the difference between, in our business model, if you're shipping a panel from West Texas to West Texas, that cost might be 75 cents a panel. But if you're shipping it from California to Georgia, that could be $6 or $7 a panel. And that just blows everything apart because we're always competing not just against other solar panel recyclers, but really our main competition is the incumbent player, which is landfill. And landfill, while not free by any means, it is cheaper than recycling. And so getting your footprint right was a key piece. There's a lot went into that. But then it's also things like how many panels can you get into a truck? Whether it's driving 50 miles or 500 miles, that makes a big difference. So we spent a lot of time thinking through all this packaging that's been designed for new solar panels. Well, with the new solar panel, you really do have to care the break. They're mostly glass. You have all this special packaging for that that's pretty expensive. For an old panel, you don't need that. But you also can't just throw it on a pallet and put it in a truck. You need special dunnage that we've designed that can replace pallets and make it much more efficient to get the pallet there in the first place. You know, imagine you can only put like 100 pallets on a truck empty. That takes a lot of extra carbon and cost to get the pallet there in the first place. We designed a special dunnage solution that can handle huge projects and all gets over in a single truck. And then we designed packaging instructions around that. Those kinds of things really end up making a huge difference in our business. And so we are a technology company, and innovation and the patents and all that are really critical, but it's also that optimizing around reverse logistics is a major difference in what your margins look like at the end of the day.
A lot of climate tech companies have died with the notion that like the innovation's awesome, but we actually don't really know how to just run a factory. There's too much AC going, or we didn't really know anything about logistics and the trucks and how you stack. Like that is those, because they stack, right? Those costs stack. And then you get to a place where they're out of control and the unit economics fall apart.
That's it. And at the end of the day, you can't beat unit economics, right? The spreadsheet always wins. And I think a ton of companies fail on, they have this great technology, but they didn't think about like, where should the factory go? Where do I make this thing? Or how do I get it to all work? And so having somebody who cut his teeth at Amazon, right? Rob Vinge, I mean, that is their unique differentiator, I would argue, is how good they are at reverse logistics, but also Subi. He spent 20 years, he founded Nextracker, so that's a giant tracking company. He founded Solaria, and he knew how you handle your shipping and move those panels around is so important. So he was very early on, like, we need to prioritize this as part of our unique value proposition. And that was a key to our team, but it's also a key to our ongoing businesses. We're constantly looking at how you optimize on the reverse logistics side.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, one more question before we move on. But I think what I heard you say, as you discussed where you were citing your locations, where you're citing your factories for recycling, that part of what goes into that calculation is also some sense of sequencing. Where are solar panels today? How old are those installations? How quickly will the demand for solar recycling or solar panel recycling be in that geography? Because it's not all, oh, there's 10 million panels in that state, we should go be there. Well, if they're all new, they're not going to be recycled for 20 years or sometime in the future.
It's actually a multi-layered analysis because age isn't the only determinant of whether or not a panel is going to reach end of life. It turns out that right now, one of the bigger drivers of broken panels is hailstorms and extreme weather.
Wow.
And that doesn't necessarily track to age of panels. It doesn't at all track. In fact, it's the opposite, which is we're seeing that a lot of the newer projects are going into places like Texas and West Texas in particular, and those projects may only be a year or two old, but a hailstorm rolls through there and will obliterate 1 million panels in a storm, which is not an insignificant number of panels. So when we looked at where we're placing our sites, part of the reason we started in West Texas is because that's where you were seeing these very large extreme weather events, climate-driven events, abnormally large hailstorms of like grapefruit-sized hail, just hammering very large new projects. Like a few of the projects we've picked up, they hadn't even hit COD yet, like they hadn't electrified. They had just been getting installed, and because it hadn't electrified yet, they weren't able to put it into hail stow. Like modern tracking systems, when a hailstorm's coming, the operator can hit a button and it'll go to 60 or 75 degrees and protect a lot of those panels. But there's a period of time where that glass is sunny side up And if you get caught, it's a mess. So anyway, I'm just putting it out there that part of our strategy was also looking at where were the large volumes coming from. And because we're the leader, we were able to see that. And so that led us to first go to West Texas and then Georgia. And now we're starting to think about the projects that are coming off in California that really more are age-based. Those are the ones that were built in the 2010s where maybe they're significantly underperforming or a rooftop's gone bad. You got to replace the roof. Doesn't make any sense at all to take a 15-year-old project, take it off the roof, re-roof, and put that back on. At that point, you should put in a brand new project. So we've looked at a number of factors went into figuring out where to place those facilities.
I love that, man. That's so interesting to me. There's so many other interesting aspects we got to get to. And so let's talk about factory.
Okay, factory, so right.
Yeah.
So basically, once we get it to the factory, getting them off the truck as quickly as possible is crucial. And then we basically start feeding them into an automated line. And the first thing we do is we pop off the junction box. The junction box has a lot of copper in it. It's got MC4 plastics, like some pretty heavy duty and recyclable plastics. We get that off for the copper and the plastics. Then there's another machine, and basically it's a set of robots that pop the aluminum frame off. And that's a critical piece. It's quite valuable. Aluminum is getting more and more precious every day. And so being able to get the aluminum frame off cleanly and fast is crucial. And then what you're left with is, we call it the glassy laminate. So imagine it's the cells, which is where all the silver and the copper and the precious metals are, some plastics, and then glass. We need to figure out, how do you get the glass off? That is a crucial part of our process. We have invested a huge amount of R&D time in multiple different tools that effectively and efficiently get the glass off of the laminate behind it. And once you get that glass off, we want to make sure that it's very clean, because if you contaminate it all with what's in the cell material, you might get some lead in it, which would be a hazardous material. You might get other things, wiring, that could make that glass only usable for things like roadbed. And that's what a lot of our competitors do right now, is they get the glass off. They're not very their tools aren't as precise as ours, and so that glass is really only good for downcycling into applications, using it for roadbed, which is fine. It's better than landfill, but it's not great.
It's not high value. Yeah, it's not high value.
It's not that valuable. Whereas we're able to get that glass off so cleanly that right now we can send it to a processor who upcycles it into fiberglass, which is a pretty decent application of the glass. But our real vision, and something that I'm super excited about, is to really make this business model work. You want to be able to create value-added products from the recycled materials you're getting off, because you can get paid a lot more for something like a glass sheet than you get paid for just the raw cullet that goes into fiberglass. So we designed our tools that it gets the glass off the panel pure enough that you can actually melt it down to make new solar glass and sell those solar glass sheets back to the solar industry, so that you have truly closed the loop on the solar economy. And the vision is, how do you start doing that then for the aluminum frames, right? It wouldn't be that hard. You get the aluminum frame off. It shouldn't be that hard to now make new aluminum frames, right? And every time you do that, by adding that value, you get more revenue, you get more margins, and you can reduce the cost of recycling to your customers, because you're just getting more and more value out of each panel. And that's a very unique part of what SolarCycle does, is get extremely clean glass off that can be turned into new sheets. But then at the end of that, what we have is what we call the solar circuit board. So if you think about e-waste, a big part of the whole e-waste process is trying to get out that circuit board so that you can get the gold and the other precious metals that are on it. Well, in the case of a solar panel, what you're left with is basically the cells, which is silicon, silver, and copper, with some plastic laminate on it. And for those watching on YouTube, this here is one of our solar laminates that we got off of a hail site. You can see it basically rolls up like a yoga mat. The thing probably weighs, I don't know, 10 pounds, something like that. We've gotten all the glass off, the junction box, the frame, and you can see that in here, all this, each of those little lines, that's the silver. And you can see it's like, it would be very hard to get that out easily, right?
Let me just say this one quick, just for our listeners. So Jesse was holding up a very thin sheet, and what you're actually seeing is the silver. It looks just basically like flat on the surface, almost like you'd have to go. It's almost like lottery, like you're scraping off with a nickel trying to see if you win. I mean, that flat.
Yeah. In each of these laminates in a panel, there's probably somewhere between 10 and 20 grams of silver across a 60 to 70 pound panel. So it's not very much, but once you've removed the glass and you remove the plastic, you're left with about 3% of the weight of a panel, but that's where like 60% of the value is. So the whole vision of this company has been, how do you, as efficiently as possible, get to those metals,
Brilliant.
get those metals back into the supply chain? And so our initial process was we take that yoga mat of cells, which is basically all the silicon and the silver and the copper and plastics, put it up through a shredder, and then we had special grinders that would get it to a very precise size. And then we had another tool that Pablo had designed that used other mechanical forces to basically separate magnetic pieces of the panel from anything that was non-metallic, so the plastics essentially. And within that, we would get these big super sacks full of solar metal, and we would then send that off to a smelting partner in northern Canada, and they would be able to refine that down to pure silver and copper and other things. That was our, I would call it sort of Gen 1 process. And we found that partner. We've recently secured a 3-year exclusive deal to work with them. And now we're able to just send that solar circuit board to them, and they are able to use the plastics as fuel to power the furnace. And they are able to get out from that process like pure silver bars, 99.99% pure copper foil, and they get out the lead and make new lead bars, all of which can be sold back to making new solar panels. And so that is basically our process in a nutshell. Like I said, there's sort of two different versions of it, but we're moving increasingly towards that second one because it actually gives you better recovery rates, better value extraction. It's just like twice as fast. So therefore, we're able to get closer and closer to that point where recycling isn't much more expensive than landfilling. And that's one of our goals as a company, is what we call landfill parity. I'm sure if you've tracked clean energy, you always heard about the holy grail for the 2000s and early 2010s was grid parity, where the cost of clean energy and solar is no more expensive than the cost of coal and gas. Well, we reached that. It was great. Major milestone. Now it's much cheaper to do solar and batteries than coal and gas. Well, we're working towards landfill parity, where you can bring the cost of recycling through these kinds of innovations on the technology side, on the off-taker side, on the front-end reverse logistics side, to be at a place where our customers, it becomes a no-brainer to recycle because we're able to offer it to them at roughly the same price they'd pay for landfilling. That's one of our big goals as a company.
Of course, that's where you have to get to drive the bulk of the market. What's interesting to me is you've assembled a team that comes from the industry. Home solar, multiple millions of solar panels on homes. It's a fragmented market. Commercial, the mid-market, and industry, still fragmented. And I know that's a hard market to identify, but you can probably figure out who's got solar panels, right? And then you have the very large utility scale size solar farms where you know everyone, right?
And that's our core customer for sure. Yeah. I think like 80% of solar in this country are controlled by those companies. And there's only 50 or 60 of them. And so we know those people and know what they care about and what matters to them. And that is part of how we've been able to get so much traction with the biggest customers in the space.
So let's talk about that, because as I have heard you talk about the kind of path to market, selling into these types of organizations, it seems to me like it may be a little bit different than other high growth markets within the overall clean energy transition. What I mean by that is on Supercool, when most of the climate companies that we talk to, when they're going to market, again, whether it's a Trove that we talked about that's doing re-commerce on a Patagonia website and making used products available, today they will 100% lead with, this is about margin for you, Patagonia, not mission. This is about a low customer acquisition cost. This is about higher lifetime value because people do appreciate that you're offering the service. Meaning we're going to go sell Michael Kors and Carhartt and whomever else, Steve Madden, on the economics of why resale is such a good idea for their business. And then once it's installed and once you can go on, name your big brand who's doing resale on their site, then everybody loves talking about the climate impact because the technology works. But it sounds like this sale is in all of the above where the sustainability actually does matter because you have huge customers who do really, really care and are motivated by that. Not necessarily more than the economics, but all of the above. So it probably creates a different entree into these organizations than in some other aspects of where the clean energy transition operates in a way.
Yeah,
is that fair?
It's definitely fair. In fact, a lot of our early sales was me going in and meeting with the sustainability directors and then getting connected to the procurement team. And that is how we started. But it's a little hard in this case to divorce economics from sustainability. And the reason I say that is because these companies, our main customers are, say, the asset owners, the people who are building these very large solar farms out in the desert.
Like who would that be?
One of our first big utility scale customers was AES. EDP is a very big company. ENGIE, Ørsted. We have long-term contracts with almost 100 of the largest solar companies in the world. Brookfield is another example of a very large company we have a contract with. It's the really big asset owners that have multiple gigawatts of solar installed all over. And for perspective, each gigawatt, roughly speaking, is 3 million panels, something like that. So it just gives you a sense. So if you're next year and you're sitting on 15 gigawatts, you got like 45 million panels you're dealing with, right? And like in the United States right now, there's something like 800 million solar panels installed. That means there's like 2 panels for every American citizen out there, globally installing 1 billion panels a year. We're soon going to have more panels than people in the world, and they're mostly owned by a small set of companies, the big asset owners. And so those are the folks that we work with. And then the other small caveat to that is there are a few of the very large residential players that are the big leasing companies like, say, Sunrun. That was our first customer. As you heard earlier, we're sending trucks at a time, right? Like that's a big part of our business. We're not set up to send a pickup truck to pick up the 20 panels that are on my roof. But if you're a big leasing company, when that set of panels is done and you're replacing it with new panels, those all go back to a warehouse.
Copy that. Appreciate all of those numbers and all of that perspective. Yep. Your initial entree was through the sustainability, then you get connected to procurement, then I'm guessing finance.
Well, it's true. We started with sustainability, and a lot of our conversations were with the head of sustainability at these big companies say, we should do this. What we ended up finding was those big customers, like an AES or EDP, the people they're selling that power to are demanding that there's a plan in place for circularity, for end of life. So who are they selling the power to? They're selling the power to Microsoft, an investor in SolarCycle. They're selling it to Amazon. They're selling it to Meta. All of those companies not only have had made major commitments to greenhouse gas reductions and the Paris Accord and that kind of like net zero stuff, they've also made very large commitments within their sustainability portfolio on circularity and reducing their overall impact on landfills and ideally trying to close the loop. So why does that come back to economics? If I am a major solar asset owner, like an AES or a Brookfield or a NextEra, if the people who are buying power from me are saying, it matters if you recycle or not, that's not a sustainability question anymore. That's a can I get my project sold question. And it is now increasingly becoming a requirement that if you are out there building a new project and you want somebody to buy that power from you, that you want to sign a power purchase agreement for 20 years with a company like Microsoft or Meta or Amazon, you better have an answer for how you're planning on recycling all those panels. And that's why I say like those conversations are no longer with the sustainability person. That's like with the procurement people. That's with the people who are in what is called origination, the people who are originating the contracts, working with those buyers. And so that's why I think it's a little hard to say, are we basing our business simply on a green premium? Or is it really, at this point, to do business now and build projects, you have to have a clear, articulated plan for how you are going to recycle those panels. Does that make sense? How it's not just purely green premium, right? It's not just a feel-good thing. It's like, you can't, there's a lot of places, by the way, in this country right now where you're not going to get past the local hearing committees and zoning committees if you don't have a recycling plan in place. So that's not, oh, I'm doing it because it feels good, or it's like I'm simply tracking it for my sustainability report. That's like, I live and die based on whether or not I can get my project approved. And a key thing to getting projects approved these days is, can you demonstrate how you're not going to fill that landfill with, like I said, a gigawatt project, which is kind of a standard size project? That's 3 million panels, each weighing 70 pounds. Like, that would overwhelm most local landfills. You would see that from space. You know what I'm talking about? You kind of have to have an answer at this point, and we're providing that answer. And that's why I say it is very important for us to keep showing how we can drive the price down, because we ultimately need to make sure solar can compete with things like coal and gas and other choices that customers have. But it's not really optional anymore if you landfill versus recycle. It is like a core business objective.
Yeah, and I understand the drivers. And then I can see from the SolarCycle perspective, of course, the lower we can drive down the cost to a SolarCycle customer, an AES or whoever, by making our process, as we've talked about today, as efficient as possible at every single phase, and then go recycle into increasingly higher value add products and really try and drive circularity back into this industry. One is going to make us just more profitable and be able to drive the scale of our own company, but it just enables this entire flow to work. And then I think the other thing that is on the table that you were cognizant of from the beginning when founding the company, or when your team was founding the company, was saying there just simply isn't enough material here in the US, or potentially elsewhere. If we're going to remove coal and fossil fuels and get to solar, likely is the biggest driver. I mean, just on those cost curves, we just have to figure out the circularity here. We have to get these materials back. We just have to do it at such a massive scale, an incomprehensible scale.
Incomprehensible. It is shocking. Here's a factoid I learned after starting the company that motivates me every day, which is, take a guess. What percentage of the world's silver supply currently goes to making solar panels, if you had to guess?
I mean, I would say 4 or 5%. I don't know. Low.
Which
3-4%.
would be high. It's actually 20%, getting close to 20%.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
And it's growing. This is the thing.
Wow.
And that's just one example. You look at aluminum, for all the aluminum that solar panels are going to need, for the 50 gigawatts that are now being assembled in the United States, if that was all to come from the United States, that would consume 158% of America's aluminum supply, right? So you start looking at this stuff, and it's kind of crazy. Like, I was watching your episode with cyclic materials and really impressed with all that, but it's a very different business model in the sense that those magnets are super valuable, but also celebrating 1 ton, which is great. Super valuable, really impressive. I love what they're doing. They're also portfolio company of Microsoft like we are. And we're dealing in hundreds of thousands of tons of material. It's not as valuable, but like, we are still running out of aluminum. We're running out of silver. We're running out of copper. And that's where, like, we have to figure out how to close the loop, because I think we have enough of those materials to build the first wave of the terawatts of solar and batteries and wind that we need. But you don't have enough material to do that twice. Like, if all of those materials ended up in a landfill, there's not enough left over. So we have to close that loop. And that's what this company's been founded to do. Is today the volumes are pretty small, right? We're getting, in the US, maybe it's 5 million panels a year is the total addressable market today in the US, which is not nothing, but it's relatively small. But that's heading to tens of millions of panels by the end of this decade. And eventually we'll be seeing hundreds of millions of panels reaching end of life every year, potentially up to 1 billion panels, as you said earlier. And we need to figure out, before that happens, how do we develop all these networks, whether it's the front end and the reverse logistics optimized, or all the back end off-takers and the relationships and the business agreements, to ensure that all those materials, once you've gotten them all refined, get back in to the things you need in the first place, the solar panels or the batteries, et cetera. And so the way I see this company and our competitors, we're creating this market now when the volumes are all relatively small, so that when this thing really pops and you hit this inflection point in the next 2 or 3 years, and all these older projects that were built in the 2010s start repowering, we're ready to do that at scale and cost effectively. Because today we're doing it, but like, we're doing 1 million or 2 million panels a year capable today. and some of our competitors are maybe in that zone, but we're not ready for tens of millions of panels in this country, and that's what we need to get ready for here in the next several years.
What strikes me as I hear you talking about this is that, one, if you're not in the industry, and really probably if you're just not in the solar industry, it's so hard to comprehend the scale and size of how big these solar farms are. When you're talking about hundreds up to like 1,000+ acres, just all solar panels, it's so much.
It is mind-boggling. Right? Yeah, like I was recently at a site, one of these hailstorms that hit in Texas, and if I remember correctly, it was like 48 square miles. It was the size of San Francisco. It took us like 3 hours. Now, granted, these are like rutted dirt roads, but it took us like 3 hours to drive around the whole property and get around. I mean, these things are very large. Yet, if you look at what's happening in China, these are teeny little projects compared to how China is developing on their solar farm, right? Like they're powering, I can't remember how many they installed last year, but it's 10x what we did. And these projects are massive, and they're moving all those electrons from out where there aren't a lot of people through high voltage DC lines into Beijing and other, population centers. That's the kind of stuff we're going to need to figure out how to do here too, or we're not ultimately going to be able to control our greenhouse gas emissions and create a sustainable energy supply. Now you're talking about billions of panels here in the U.S. And
yes, and I think it's more understood about how much energy needs to flow into the grid if we're going to electrify everything. And then you can talk gigawatts. People are like, okay, gigawatts, I can kind of convert that into this many households, et cetera. But I think what's less understood as well when you think about the size of these solar farms, and like you said, I was at one that was the size of San Francisco, is to come back to what you said also about, I love talking to Modded Cyclic Materials, and I love the concept of vermin mining. Again, that is a high value add. It's a different part of this circular equation, right? But we know that climate change is physics, right? And climate change is heavy stuff, is material. And people know a little more about like cement and steel, and this is like, you can't software your way. You can't really AI your way to solving climate, because it is about you make all this stuff, and therefore the stuff has an impact. And you're talking about gigatons.
These are atoms,
and that's,
not bytes. Yeah.
And this is what I'm saying. Like, it's hard for me to appreciate until this conversation that there are gigatons of, just by weight, solar panels that if we don't figure out how to recycle that stuff and reuse it and flow it back into the supply chain, or maybe said the other way, if we figure out how to do that, then you really do decarbonize the embodied carbon, right? You take the carbon out of a solar panel, of a new solar panel, and that's the way that we get to the future.
And this is what excites me so much about this business, and why I decided to leave Sierra Club, where I was like national program director, and I loved it there. But to me, this is the opportunity. If we can close the loop on the clean energy economy and get all those materials back in, we've solved the problem. And if we don't, we're hosed. There's no solving the climate problem without solving the circularity problem. And so, you're really putting your finger on one of the things that most excites me about this business.
Kind of get it in a different way that I didn't fully appreciate before we got into this conversation. I know there's so much more that we could get to, but this was awesome. I mean, I really loved the opportunity to like get into the guts of the business with you and dig into the logistics. The technology is fascinating. The technology, I think, is probably where people are most always like, oh, how do you do it? How do you rip apart this thing and get everything? But I find the reverse logistics and creating the whole value chain, bringing on the right partners in the right moments to actually create this at scale, just-in-time value chain that actually enables this flow to take place to get us to the future. I just love that. I find that so inspiring.
It's definitely a technology company, but that's only part of what is going to be important to make these businesses successful. It's the reverse logistics to get them there, and then it's also all these off-take networks and figuring out the best partners on that side. I do want to go back really quickly to that last conversation about how much space solar panels were taking up, how much mass, and compare it to what's happening with the fossil fuel industry, right? Because I do sometimes feel like when people hear that, then they're like, oh my God, this is crazy. That's taking so much land. We should go back to these little small gas plants or nuclear plants because they only take up this much space. While it's true, you can make 500 megawatts of power in a gas plant that is only taking up, I don't know, the size of a large school, not the size of San Francisco. That's just where they're burning the fuel. If you think about all the areas where they're fracking for that fuel, all the space taken for the pipelines, all the things that went into that, the footprint consumed by the fossil fuel industry from coal to gas to oil is so much bigger than what you see for clean energy. But also critically to the mission and vision of SolarCycle is when you blow the top off a mountain to get the coal out, you take that coal, you burned it. Yeah, it's up in the atmosphere, but the bottom line is it's not recyclable. There's no recovering it. Whereas with a solar panel, these are some of the most recyclable appliances, right? It's all glass and metals. And so once you build it, once you've made it, once you've installed those terawatts, once you have it, then you can recycle it over and over again. And the crazy thing about solar is that because it gets so much more efficient, right? It's not quite as efficient as Moore's law, but panels built 15 years ago were maybe 200 watts. 240 watts. Now they're 700 watts. Not only are they infinitely recyclable, but you can keep building off it because you can take one old panel and the materials in it and essentially make 3 new ones. And so I just wanted to put that out there because to me, what makes these businesses so necessary and exciting is they can truly be a closed loop system where we can keep powering prosperity and the kind of world we want to live in without having to destroy the planet because you can just keep reusing those same materials over and over and over again.
That gives me a lot to ponder, and I can see why you said, okay, yes, I'm going to now dedicate a big portion of the rest of my life to this challenge.
It's a big challenge.
Massive. And so, yeah, anyway, it all excites me, but I think for me, yes, and I understand that you're a tech company and you want to make sure that you're known as a tech company, but I think that it's all of the IP that's understood as you build out that entire value chain, which also kind of becomes the moat in its own right, but it's really also that's the complexity that gets organized is really what's so mission critical as much as, yes, the core technology in the factory itself. It's all of the above that is what's going to win the market. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you for coming on. Thank you for walking me through all of it.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Jesse.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks so much for listening to my conversation with Jesse. If you enjoyed it and appreciate the conversations we have about innovators and innovations powering the low-carbon economy, please take a moment to subscribe and leave us a review. It's the best way you can help us reach others who would benefit from these conversations too. See you next time.